Hi there. Welcome to History Chats. Um, yeah, usually I don't start this way. And in fact, about an hour ago, I did not start this way. I started normally. But the thing is, I did not check the box that let me, when I went to start the presentation, I don't know, you can see the video editor program here. There's no audio levels down here. That's because the microphone was not on. And I went for about 5, 6 minutes before I realized this fact. Thankfully, we caught it, and eventually we were able to, go back and do a take two, which is what we did. It's still a great program, but I do then continually refer to the fact that there is some audio issues. Whoops. Um, that means that I need to explain what I'm talking about. So when it gets to that point, that's the deal. Not a big deal. Still a great program, and this is still going to be a quicker introduction than you would have gotten normally. So hopefully what comes out okay in the wash. But the only thing that I'm going to cut out that might be helpful to know, besides the fact that there's some audio issues, is the fact that we are actually, the concept of why we're talking about the last log drive is because we're doing a month of lasts. September is actually when we started doing programming back in 2020. So we're wrapping up our second full year. We'll hit 100 episodes by the end of the month, which is kind of crazy. And obviously, we still have some technical issues to work out occasionally. Happens to the best of us. But anyway, because we're doing the last month before our third year, we're just going to be talking about some lasts. So that's why we are talking about this particular story about the last log drive. Still a great program. I hope you enjoy the take two, if you will, of the program today. Okay, this might run a little bit later than I expected, but we'll start over. Sorry about that. Let's talk about a log drive. Okay, so as I said, we're talking about log drives. This is the last log drive here. I've been trying to find a way to talk about this for a few years now because, or not necessarily finding, but I've been curious about this picture specifically because of this is the break room of the Marathon County Historical Society. So sitting there having lunch, maybe having some tea, I would stare at this picture and go, huh, I wonder what's going on here. It's a really interesting picture. And I don't know why it was produced. Back in 2010 or so, we decided to take this picture and a couple others from the series that was produced back in the day and put it on the wall. We needed some place to put them there. I don't really know specifically why it was produced originally, but I do know that it was given to us in the year 2000 by the University of Wisconsin Extension here in Marathon County. I don't know what they were using it for, but I know that the other thing that I know about this is that it was produced from our collection. The original photograph that was produced came from us. And I know that for a couple different reasons, but, oh, yeah, that was supposed to be coming up earlier. Anyway, so this is the photograph. It gets cropped a little bit from the original for the stuff that's on the wall in the break room. But this is the full photograph. I also cropped it to kind of fit the screen a little bit better. Yeah. So this is a log drive, right? It's a great picture of a log drive in a lot of ways. It's interesting to note this is not the only picture from that series. We know it's the last log drive because of the captions. We have originally two original prints of this image, as well as a negative and some reproductions. And the original prints, these are the captions that are added. And I think the stuff on the left, this bit here, last drive, is probably added a little bit later. But the first bit was original to the print. And so last drive, Wisconsin River, which they then took the last and added it to this to make it consistent. But log drivers on the Wisconsin River, 1912. So we know a little bit about this, at least allegedly, right? We can't always take what's written on photographs or on the back of photographs as gospel truth necessarily, but it's often a good place to start, and usually they're correct. So as I said, it's from a series of photographs. There's a bunch of them here. There are 6 showing the log drive here, and Then there are, and the similarities in terms of the people that are involved, as well as the equipment and everything. This is them, taking some of the log drivers out or not taking them out, but like hosting a lunch sort of deal. Um, yeah. So, is it the last log drive? Um, just catching the. Yeah, okay. This is a book that was published in 1956. And I just want to just actually explain what is a log drive. Let's set aside, for the sake of narrative tension, I'm going to hold back the answer that I have come up with, whether this was a picture of the last log drive or not. Instead, we're going to just talk about what the log drive is. As I said, this book, Loggers' Words of Yesteryears by Sorbin and Ebert, is kind of an interesting thing. It has a nice glossary of terms of everything you need to know about logging. Yeah, it defines it as transporting logs from the woods to the sawmill down a stream or a river. So basically what this means is, you're going to cut trees down in the woods. By the 1880s, they start to shift towards using railways. The trains become the main way of doing this. But back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, you would do log drives, and you would have to float them down the river. That was the only real way to get them from the woods down to the sawmills, and then from there, to market, right? So that's what we're seeing here. That is a log drive. To do this, you're not just going to dump a bunch of logs in the river and hope that they get to your destination, right? There is going to have to be somebody going along with them, and that's where the log drivers come in. There's a bunch of other colorful names. I also colorized a bunch of these pictures. I didn't really know how to organically throw them in, so I'm just going to throw them in as well. Kind of fun projects to colorize. Anyway, the log drivers. They've also have very colorful terms like caddy men, river pigs, river hogs, and river rats. So you can see kind of a theme there. And I've seen maybe some others that kind of are perhaps used like water instead of river. But yeah, and these guys had the job of going along with the logs as they floated down the river through the twists and turns and around rapids and eddies and all of the dangers of the river in order to get them, to the sawmill. And this could take days. And so, yeah, it's a long process, and it was dangerous, and it was a lot of work, right? But somebody had to do it, and so that fell to the river pigs. Now, to aid in this, there is this notable feature here, the Wannigan. Now, if you're a member of the Historical Society here, you might recognize the name as the title of our newsletter. We call our newsletter the Wannigan. Well, it goes back to this piece of logging era, in this era. Also note, it's spelled a bunch of different ways. Yeah. So this is a picture of them in the Wannigan, and you can see kind of behind them, there's a bunch of like cooking implements. Basically, again, the description here, there's a bunch of descriptions, there's a bunch of ways to spell it, there's a bunch of ways to actually define it. These are some of the obvious ones. Originally, I think it came from an Ojibwe word meaning Wanakan or something like that, pronounced that way, which basically meant like supply pit. And it gets adopted by the fur traders and trappers coming down from Canada, and then it gets applied, like a lot of things, to the lumber, because a lot of those guys then moved it into lumbering. So it can be where the supplies of the camp are set. It can also be, as they note, in Wisconsin, it was specifically the Cook's raft, which went down the river behind the logs. So this is what they would do. If you needed to take a break, you could go to the Wannigan, get some food, and then kind of take it in shifts to make sure that everybody stays active and fueled for everything. Apparently, it can also be named. It was also known as the Ark, or a shanty boat, or a van. So some fun logging terminology there. Speaking of stuff borrowed from the early French Canadian explorers, the bateau, which is French for boat. Or I guess in this case, maybe Quebecois, so the Canadian version of French. But yeah, this is well, okay, it's not as obvious here. It's kind of in front of the Wannigan. The Wannigan is the tent, right? It's kind of on logs. And then you have the bateau, which is, in this case, I think they lashed it to the Moanagan so that these older guys don't accidentally fall in the river. But this would have operated separately. It's a flat bottom boat that has long, elongated points. And that allows them to kind of cut through the river, specifically with these guys and their punt poles. So the punt poles then allow you to basically, put the poles into the water and push, and that's how you maneuver. There's no outboard motor at this point in time. So this is how they would move around, and they could, cut through the air. So as the logs are heading down the river, if they get jammed in the beginning and all the rest of the logs get then pushed onto it, it could be very difficult and dangerous to sort out. And obviously that's not what you want. So they would get in the boat, and the two guys on the ends would push along, and then the people in between would take wielding hooks. In this case, they probably use peavey hooks. And the difference between a peavey hook and a cant hook, which I didn't know until about a week ago, a peavey hook has like a full metal cap that is part of the hook on the end. That's used primarily on water, whereas cant hooks don't necessarily have that full end, just the hook that comes out. And that was primarily used on land. But both of them were a way to kind of maneuver things and to push off and to maneuver the logs. So that's how they would make sure the logs didn't get tangled up as they went. So there's some tools, there's some boats. There's also this oddity, which maybe you caught in the original picture. And to be honest, this is one of the curiosities. As I would sit at lunch or, taking a break or whatever, and I would look at that picture in the break room, and I would kind of wonder, or occasionally if you needed something to talk about, a small talk of just being like, hey, do you think that that's actually a piece of logging equipment? Or is it, something on the picture, right? Is it a scratch? Is it some sort of blemish? On the actual print downstairs, there's a lot of cosmetic damage, but there's nothing that in the picture itself, nor, as far as I can tell, is it in any of the prints that we have, the original or reproductions. But it's all there. In fact, it's there on the original negative that we have. See, there it is. As I said, we have the original negative, and so this is what that shows. And then when you make it, so basically, I had Bob Sanders, who is our volunteer here and is a retired forensic photographer and has a long career in crime labs and things like that. He, has experience. I kind of showed this to him and said, what do you think? And he said, almost certainly this was something that was done during the development process. You're in the dark room, you got the sort of processing of the images, developing them, or getting the images themselves so that you can, they're not light sensitive. And as you're, fiddling around, you take, one edge of the negative, and you just, whoop, and you just accidentally touch it, and that can be enough just to remove some of the materials, and then it creates this white space because it's just translucent. And then when you develop it, all the white bits become dark, and the dark becomes light, and you get that. So there you go. So it's originally on the negative, right? But one of the interesting things here is we don't have the only negative. Because during the research for this process, I found that the State Historical Society down in Madison, well, they also have an image which they think is an original negative. And I don't doubt them. They probably would know better than me, just looking at the image here. So they scanned it and did what I did and flipped it, and that's the result. So do they have the original or do we have the original? One of them is a copy, right? Surely there can't be two images. Well, sort of. See, here's our image, and here's their image. Notice there's no scratch. But if you looked closely, you might have noticed that everything kind of shifted, right? And that's not because I didn't line it up correctly. These are the edges, that's what it is. And even if you do line it up correctly, which I did here, you can see that things are still shifting. Because as it turns out, even though these pictures, both negatives, were taken from the same camera, by the same person in the same moment, from the same vantage point, these are actually not the same image. Even with the quality, I didn't, obviously our negative, I got a better image than taking what they had off the internet. But Very interesting. And that's because this is not a normal photograph. This is a photograph for stereoscopic viewing. What I mean by that? Well, it's a stereoscope. Now, some of you may be familiar with this concept, others may not. Basically, back in the 1800s, when they started to find photographs becoming a thing, right? They decided, it's great seeing these two-dimensional images and being able to like see something that you've never seen before or remember it after the fact in crystal clear, this is what it was. But we don't see in 2 dimensions. We see in, well, not 3 dimensions, right? If I'm looking at the back of this book, I can't tell what the front is. I can't see physically the front. But it's not fully 2 dimensions because we have 2 eyes. Most of us have 2 working eyes, and so we can see in stereo. It's just enough to give something a little depth. And so knowing this, those 2-dimensional images, those prints were great, but people started to wonder if there's a way to make it 3 dimensions. What happens if we take images that are the exact width from cameras that are right next to each other, the same width as a human eye? It turns out it's kind of, you can do that, which is what this is, but then it's kind of hard to actually like see it unless you have one of these. Here, I'm going to go to the full camera. Let's see. I believe the guy who took the pictures is this guy. All evidence seems to suggest, if you go to the State Historical Society, if you scroll down, you maybe saw the creator's name is the Dr. Joseph Smith from the Millard Smith family papers. Our stereoscope collection is labeled and comes eventually from the Smith family. So this likely is him. He's a fairly important, Dr. Joseph Franklin Smith comes here in 1908, becomes very important in the early medical scene in the 20th century, helping get St. Mary's Hospital going and things like that. But he was also a bit of a shutterbug. Now we have some negatives, they have some negatives down in the State Historical Society. Yeah. So again, you can kind of see that by switching back and forth, it's not quite, it's definitely not the same as actually looking through, one of these. But it does create an interesting example, and it does kind of give a little bit of the depth that you can get a sense of. So, and this is the camera or a camera similar to what they would have used. Again, it's one camera, but it has 2 lenses, 2 apertures, and it creates 2 negatives. This is the American version. They become kind of, they're certainly not the pioneers. Most of the good cameras you would have gotten from Europe, but actually Joseph Smith, before he comes to Wasa, was doing some studying in Vienna. So maybe he picked it up there, hard to know. So that's one answer to the question. Answer to the question, which negative is right? The answer is both. The family, at some point, I don't know if they forgot that this was originally a stereoscope, or they cut, I don't know if there was one negative or there was 2 negatives that were side by side, but they decided to give one to the State Historical Society, and then they gave the other one to us. So we have the right image on the stereoscope, and down in Madison, they have the left, which is kind of a cool connection there. But we've kind of been procrastinating here, especially when I didn't unmute for a bit. I guess if I cut that out and you're watching later, I talked for about 5 minutes before realizing I didn't unmute. Whoops. I will probably cut that out for the video later, the recording. Anyway, moving past that, let's get back to the question at hand. This is labeled the last log drive. Is it actually the last log drive to ever take place? Certainly by the 1880s and 90s, increasingly the lumber mills are getting their logs from train cars. The trains are bringing in the logs. And so while they do small-scale log drives, by the end of the 1800s, this really diminishes to the point where you don't see them very often. or if they are, they're smaller. So at what point does it actually stop? Well, hard to know 100%. Depends on how you want to clarify things. But I will say that up until 1925, there was the John Weeks Company in Stevens Point, and they were getting a lot of their logs from the Big O Plain, which means that they were taking it down through part of Marathon County from the Big O Plain to the Wisconsin River and then down to Stevens Point. And so they would have passed through Knowlton. And in Knowlton, they recognized in 1926, this is the first time in memory that there hasn't been a Wannegan, that there hasn't been a bunch of loggers coming through the area. 1926, that's a bit later than 1912, huh? So it's not literally the last log drive ever, but maybe it's the last log drive in some other sense. So let's keep going. I think some of the answer here, I thought, well, maybe we need to figure out who these people are, right? If we know who they are, maybe we can kind of narrow down when this picture was taken. Specifically, I mean, the logging guys, the actual like caddymen or river pigs in the background, it's going to be hard. But these guys provide an interesting sort of thing. These guys are dressed to the nines. They got watch chains and three-piece suits and hats. These are not working class stiffs, right? These are not, they might have had early lumbering experience, doing labor, but these are the mill owners. These are the managers, right? So maybe we can identify them. So I did my best. And here's kind of, I'm going to put a caveat here. I could be wrong. I'm working from incomplete information, but I think this might be C.S. Gilbert, who is kind of tangentially involved in some ways in some of the early lumbering at this point. Certainly the young guy of the group. Hiram Stewart kind of is a fit for the guy on the right. This is the Stewart of the Barker Stewart Mill of that fame. And maybe Stewart Avenue. I'm not sure exactly if they explicitly said it was him or Alexander, but no relation between those two, by the way. But Hiram Stewart lived in Wausau, and he operated the mill on Barker Stewart Island, which is where the name comes from. Previously, they called it Backendue Island. Anyway, the last person, and those two guys, I'm like, they look like they could fit better than anybody else. But Walter Alexander, I'm almost positive, is the second guy from the right. Walter Alexander he had come to town and had kind of found a place with the Alexander Stewart Lumber Company, which is one of the big ones here for many, many years. He ends up working his way to become the right-hand man of Alexander Stewart himself. He manages the company. He's does take care of the day-to-day, and by the end of the 20th, by the turn of the 20th century, he is a notable businessman in his own right and with his own interests in managing things, but still very much a friend and protege of Alexander Stewart. So he's here, so that's kind of cool. But in some ways, the story kind of hinges on this fourth guy, because I don't really have a good answer for you who that is, right? Here's a little close-up of him. Again, colorized some stuff. Who is he? Because I think the answer to the question, when was this actually taken and what's the context, might hinge on him. That's what I was operating on for a long ways. So this is the picture, again, that's down in the break room. And when I asked, people always seem to say, well, this is obviously it's Alexander Stewart, right? Alexander Stewart came to Wausau before it was named Wausau in 1849. He worked on the river, and of course, he has this very distinct goatee or beard, right? He's always got a beard, and this guy's got a beard, right? Well, or does he? Because if you look at the other pictures, it's not a full beard, it's a mustache, which, okay, I mean, he could have shaved. But again, all the pictures that we have of Alexander Stewart show him with a full or at least partial beard. And it's kind of weird to change your style up when you're in your late 70s, early 80s. So I don't know, hard to know for sure. But let's take for granted that this is Alexander Stewart, right? Let's say it is. It would make sense why he was so, if we go back to this picture, I mean, clearly this picture was taken not just because these guys were willing to go up on the logs. Like, there's a connection between these two men. And we know Walter Alexander Stewart would have been his friend, the guy who gave him a job and kind of, a close business partner. So if it is Alexander Stewart, what does this mean for the picture? Well, it means it's not 1912. Because Stewart dies in 1912. The previous year, so back in 1910, he had been out. He and Walter had been very big proponents and investors in the new paper companies that come about. And he is out expecting the construction of the new dam down in Rothschild, the paper company. And while he's there, he trips, some loose footing, and he breaks his arm just beneath his right shoulder. And he never really recovers from that. He spends most of 1910 and 1911, in his house recovering. And at the end of the year, in December, it gets cold again in Wisconsin. And his family and friends are concerned that he's gonna, his health isn't doing well, and so they say, "Well, why don't you go to, the home?" He was actually elected to the Congress as in the House of Representatives for Wisconsin, and so he had spent many years there. They actually built and they had a second home in Washington D.C. So they said, "Go out there and recover there. The warmth will do you better." Interesting fun fact, just as an aside, that house is still in existence. It's now the embassy for the state of Luxembourg. So there you go. Anyway, unfortunately, despite probably the better humor that he was in because of the warmth and not having to deal with the Wisconsin cold, his health doesn't really get better. And then word comes in the spring that he has passed. They bring his body to Wausau and they bury him. Now, okay, this could be before 1912, but as I said, Dr. Smith doesn't come to Wausau until 1908, and he doesn't really get settled until 1909, 1910. So it's possible that the date is wrong, but that's entirely possible. If it is wrong, and this is Alexander Stewart, and he just shaved it off his beard and just left the mustache, well, that would probably mean that this last log drive is the last log drive of his company. In 1908, they stop cutting. They're bringing in stuff by lumber, but they decide, okay, the lumber industry is on the way out. We're going to kind of divest ourselves of this. They end up selling the company to, or at least the sawmill and the warehouses and everything, to Benjamin Heinemann in 1910. But in 1908, 1909, they're still like getting through the lumber that they had finished cutting. And so maybe they had a little bit of a last log drive to just sort of document, take some pictures. I don't think it's Alexander Stewart. I think it's probably actually 1912, which means it can't be him. So who else could it be? Well, another option is maybe this is his brother, John. John Stewart had also come up in the 1850s to work in the lumber industry and had started a company with his brother, Alexander, to create a very successful business. And he had become pretty rich from that. And certainly by the end of the 1850s, he moves back to Illinois. The family had actually moved from New Brunswick, Canada, to Illinois. And then, that. But he ends up spending most of his life outside of Chicago, but still very much tied to the Alexander Stewart Lumber Company up here in Wisconsin. And I don't know how often he gets up here. He's still like an officer, in 1908 when they close the company, in 1910, I should say. But I know he comes up in 1912 to see his brother off, to pay his respects at the funeral. And I know he comes back again in 1913. So what if while they're here, and I should say, I don't have actually a picture of him. I tried. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture, and none of the places in Illinois that I reached out to were able to get back to me with a positive picture. So I don't actually know if he was a mustache guy. Maybe. I think there's still a face structure, and that's kind of what I'm operating on here. That's very similar. But yeah, he would have been very close to Walter Alexander as well, and so maybe it is him. And if it is, maybe when they were, burying his brother, and notable that all the pallbearers and many of the people that took part in the funeral were like the who's who of the lumber industry back in the day. So maybe they were hanging out, and just noting that like Alexander's death, Alexander Stewart was there at the beginning. When Wausau wasn't even Wausau. And now his death, more than anything else, would have maybe felt like things are changing and the time is passing on and the days of lumbering are gone. Maybe feeling a little wistful, they decide to go out and take some pictures. Let's put some logs. Because one of the other things is like, is this even a real log drive, or did they just get some guys out? Let's get a one again, let's get some PV hooks, and let's just take some pictures. I'm not entirely sure. So maybe that's the other thing. Maybe it is 1912, maybe this is John, or maybe it is John, or maybe it's somebody else. Because the third option here, and I think that this is potentially the best explanation, is that this is actually a last log drive, And it was sort of an opportune opportunity to go out there. They visited the log drive. They caught up with as they passed through. They, hey, let's take some pictures. And the reason for this is because the year before, in 1912, or during this year, it's again hard to know, there was a huge flood that hit this area. Huge rainfall, tremendous, rainfall that hits northern the area, and all that river then all that water flows into the river, and it just comes, gets larger and larger as it comes down from Merrill to Brokaw and finally hits Wausau. And as it passes through Brokaw, it pulls all of these logs that had been stacked, waiting to be turned into wood pulp, and they just get carried into the water. And when it hits Wausau, it does a lot of damage. Bridges were washed away. Companies, you can see the Kickbush grocery store here, they had whole carts full of produce that were just washed into the river. Apparently for like the following day or two, there were just watermelons and peaches, or pears, that were just floating down the river. Thankfully, nobody died, but it was a lot, right? And all of these logs created a lot of havoc on the journey. But of course, as we know from earlier with the log drives in general, like you can't just throw them in the water, even with there's a torrential downpour feeding the flood. Those logs are going to get hung up on the way as you're leaving. I will note also that this is maybe one of the most documented moments in Wausau's history, because anybody that had a camera, including, I believe, Dr. Smith, was out taking pictures. This is a stereoscope. This is only one of the images, but this is one of those two images. And I think this is his daughter. It's a sort of a resemblance to some of the other pictures. So he was out taking some pictures as well. And so maybe this was sort of, hey, you did that. Let's get one of your camera out and do some pictures as well. Because it turns out that in the aftermath of the flood, there's a lot of logs that just get buried, just get put on the riverbanks or other things as well. So this is viewing here. It says that the logs from the flood broke loose from the booms where they were being held in Brokaw at the high water last July and floated over the banks of the river on the lowlands. And it has been slow and difficult task to get them back and finally to the mills. Then they note that hereafter there will be no more logs floated down the Wisconsin River to Wausau, as the mill owners intend to have all their logs delivered by rail. And then the next section, the past winter was the first one in 70 years or more in which no logs were brought and banked on the Wisconsin River to come to Wausau. They had basically stopped doing this, but because of the flood, well, okay, two things. This means that there's no cutting, right? There's nothing getting ready for a new. So this sentence, the last sentence I read, indicates that they weren't out in the camps. Instead of getting them ready to float down the river in the spring, they were putting them on cars to take, train cars to take to Wausau. So they weren't cutting in 1912, because this is in May. This article comes out, but they were cutting in 1911. So that means that there was a log drive in 1912. In fact, there was. And there would be another final log drive. So in a sense here, it is 1912. Almost certainly there would have been a log drive that they would have went out, because they wouldn't have known that the flood was coming at that point. They did take some pictures. It still doesn't explain who the mustachioed guy is, but at least it explains the existence of the pictures. And then the flood happens and they do another one. So in response, they thought in the moment that it was the last log drive, but it wasn't. It wasn't on the entire Wisconsin River, and it wasn't even in this section, even though the context is a little different in the aftermath of a flood. Anyway, whatever the reason, it was a great picture that, back in the 80s or 90s, whenever they made that reproduction, that they chose this. I'm glad they did, because staring at it for years while I had my break, something was percolating. And it's a great image. It shows the log drive, as we've talked about, and the technology that was used, as well as it asks some interesting questions. Yeah, that's my story. It's one last. So we are going to be continuing some more lasts for the rest of the month as we finish up our second full year of doing History Chats. Thanks for joining me and bearing with me with the technology issues. I'm going to just take a look and see whether there's any questions. I'm assuming all of these comments are telling me that the video is muted. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And as some of my relatives have said in the comments, it is my birthday today. So thank you for those wishes. Um, I don't, not really relevant, but I guess I'll acknowledge that. Yeah. Cool. Well, again, thanks for bearing with me. Thanks for watching. It was a really fun program to put together. I really enjoyed the story, and I have some really great ones coming up. Again, I'll just you know, some more coming up. Next week, Gary's going to talk about the last train, passenger train to come through here, which is not the specific one, but maybe something similar, and talk about the larger story of train travel as a way of getting around, which is the way that we did it for many years. The train changed a lot. It wasn't just the logging industry and the demise of the log drives. They changed the way that we lived our lives, and so it'd be an interesting topic to see how that all kind of came to an end. So hopefully you join us for that if you're of interest. And I think maybe we'll just call it there. So yeah, again, as always, thanks for watching. Hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next time.